Hi, welcome everybody. We are really excited that you've taken the time out of your day to join us and be part of this. My name is Leslie Laud, and I am a coach who supports schools with writing instruction. And one question that I get every fall is, how do we teach Thanksgiving? And so this is something that comes up year after year. And so I spoke with a friend of mine who is tribally enrolled with the Ojibwe Nation. And she will introduce herself in a moment. And she connected me with, and that is Joan Andeg, and she connected me with Keisha James, who is the granddaughter of you're going to say your grandfather's name because I want to make sure it's pronounced properly, but has been raised as an activist. And then I bravely approached Dr. Debbie Reese, who also agreed to join us. And this topic is so meaningful to me because I've seen families go through real difficult times when Thanksgiving is taught in schools that are not done in a way that's culturally sensitive and respectful. And so I wanted to pull this together. And about a month ago, Keisha and Joan and I met, and I was wondering, are we going to have enough time? And Keisha just said with so much passion, we have to do this. Otherwise, it's another year of the wrong kind of teaching. And that moved me and kind of startled me so much that I just got it together and we just made this happen. And I'm hoping we can do this every year. So we are each going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to pass it to Keisha James. She's going to take over and begin with her part, and then we'll hear from Dr. Debbie Reese and Joan Andeg next.
Hi everyone, let me just share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Perfect. Oop. Okay. So my name is Keisha James. I am an enrolled member of the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hedaquina, and I'm also Oglala Lakota. I'm a senior at Wellesley College and president of the Wellesley College Native American Student Association, and I'm here to talk to you guys about the Thanksgiving myth and why it's so harmful, and also break down the details of the myth so you understand exactly how much of it is wrong. And I'm going to, spoiler alert, it's all wrong. But before I begin, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about what the Thanksgiving myth actually is. And so you can see on the screen, according to popular myth, the pilgrims seeking religious freedom landed on Plymouth Rock. The Indians welcomed them with open arms, shared a harvest feast, and then conveniently faded into the background. The end. And I want you to forget everything about this and everything you've ever learned about Thanksgiving in school. Because quite simply, it did not happen the way that the book on the right-hand side portrays it. There was no friendly get-together. The native children and settler children did not play together. Things happened very differently. So the first myth is that the Thanksgiving was a friendly meal between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. There was a harvest feast that happened in 1621, which was sort of your typical English harvest feast, but it wasn't the first Thanksgiving, and the Native American population was not invited to this meal. And we know this because there was a very tall fence erected around the Plymouth colony to keep wildlife and Native Americans out, and the Pilgrims viewed Native Americans and animals as sort of the same level of nuisance. And so we're fairly sure that the Wampanoag were not invited, and there's also no historical record to actually back up the idea that the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims sat down and had a lovely harvest feast. What we do know is that the first official Thanksgiving that as we know it was declared by Abraham Lincoln in 1863 as a way of unifying the country during the Civil War. And the Pilgrims and Indians narrative was chosen because the circumstances surrounding the first English-speaking colony, Jamestown, were frankly too ugly and gory to uphold as a national myth because, as I think we all know, at Jamestown, the settlers resorted to cannibalism to survive. And so Pilgrims and Indians was a much more palatable national myth. We also know that the first official Thanksgiving was declared in 1637 by Governor Bradford of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to celebrate the massacre of over 700 Pequot women, men, and children on the banks of the Mystic River in Connecticut. And this is a quote from Governor Bradford talking about that massacre. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers, so that they were quickly dispatched and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire. Horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them this victory. And Following subsequent massacres, there would be a day of Thanksgiving. And so this is the true origin of Thanksgiving. It was to celebrate massacres of Native Americans. And you see many different days of Thanksgiving happening after 1637 following massacres. So that's the true history of Thanksgiving. The next part of the mythology is true. The Wampanoag did save the Pilgrims from starvation, partially out of basic human decency, and partially because it was actually a political move on the part of Massasoit, who was the sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. And it was a political move because the Pilgrims were not the first settlers to arrive. Settlers had been arriving for years before the Pilgrims arrived. Primarily slave traders would be capturing Native Americans all up and down the eastern seaboard. And they'd also brought plagues with them, as well as committing various atrocities against the indigenous populations. And so Massasoit had seen all of this. And so I think he figured that if he were able to save this pilgrims from starvation and create some sort of allyship between the Wampanoag Confederacy and these new settlers, his tribe might be spared. Unfortunately, he was incorrect because what the Wampanoag received for their kindness was genocide, never ending oppression, and the theft of our lands. The Pilgrims landed and were completely unprepared for the New England climate because they actually wanted to go to Virginia. That was their intended destination, but they went way off course and ended up in New England. So by the time they reached New England, they were starving. And the first thing they did when they arrived, and by the way, they didn't arrive in Plymouth, they arrived on the outer Cape in Provincetown, was to rob my ancestors' graves at Corn Hill. And sometimes I see a narrative of, the grave robbing can be excused because they were starving and looking for food. And that would be true. But A, the pilgrims knew that these were graves because they found bodies and wrote about the bodies they found. And B, the pilgrims didn't just take like winter provisions or corn or beans or the foodstuffs they found in the graves. They also took sacred ceremonial items with them, such as bowls and pots and things like that. Basically, anything pretty they saw, they took. And so this was just actual grave robbing. And the reason why the pilgrims found so many graves when they arrived was because about 3 years before the pilgrims arrived, some sort of horrible plague had spread throughout the region and decimated the local populations. Some scholars say it's smallpox. Many native people in this region don't think it was smallpox. That's sort of an oral thing that's been passed down. But it was some sort of horrific plague that decimated the entire population before the pilgrims arrived. But I don't want you all to use this as an excuse, as some people do, to say it wasn't genocide, it was disease. Because certainly disease was a part of it, but the pilgrims and their descendants and the settlers that came over after the pilgrims certainly did commit genocide against the local native populations. The second myth is the myth of coexistence. And we see a lot of, oh, the pilgrims and Indians were friends type thing. But I just want to make it clear that friends don't sell friends into slavery. Um, so, and the reason why I say that is because selling Native Americans into slavery became a very common practice among the pilgrims. Um, and for example, Squanto, or Tishquantum as his real name is, and he features very heavily in the Thanksgiving myth, was actually sold into slavery by the Pilgrims, and he was sold into slavery in Spain, eventually escaped, only to come back and find out that his entire tribe was dead of disease and also had been murdered by the Pilgrims. So um, the myth of coexistence, there wasn't coexistence. There was no pilgrims and Indians dancing happily around a pumpkin type thing. And these graphics are, quite frankly, offensive because they just paint the wrong picture and also are an erasure of the real history and the genocide that occurred. There also wasn't coexistence because the Europeans were encroaching on native land. And it's never the other way. Sometimes I see people say that it was the natives encroaching on the settlers' land, but to be clear, it was all our land, and the settlers were encroaching upon our land. They were also massacring Native Americans in large numbers and taking away natural resources. And to top it off, more settlers were arriving following the Mayflower, which was sort of the Wampanoags, like the worst scenario possible because they were hoping that it was just going to be the Pilgrims and no one would follow. But you have the ship Anne after the Mayflower and many, many other ships arriving. And so this leads us to indigenous resistance, specifically King Philip's War. And there's a tendency to vilify King Philip, whose real name is Metacom, but he was called King Philip. But I want you to put yourselves in his shoes for a second and understand that King Philip had basically witnessed and lived through the apocalypse. He'd seen people that he loved die from strange diseases that no one had ever seen before. He'd seen whole tribes and villages and settlements destroyed by these settlers. He'd seen settlers murder the people he loved. He'd seen women and girls being sold into sexual slavery, and his friends, his family members, everyone being sold into slavery in general, where one day they would be there and the next day they would be gone. And so to him and many Wampanoag, it was very much the end of the world. Um, and so King Philip's War was very much a last ditch attempt to stop the destruction of a way of life. So to me, King Philip is a hero. And I don't just say that because he's my 11th great grandfather. I say that because he was defending his land and people. Um, and King Philip's War truly had a devastating result for the Wampanoag. You can see that it was Metacom, the Wampanoag, Nipmucks, Podunks, Narragansetts, Nashaways, and Wabanakis versus the New England Confederation, Pequots, and Mohicans. And there were 3,000 losses on both sides, and following King Philip's War, hundreds of Wampanoag and their allies were publicly executed and enslaved, and his head, King Philip's head, was displayed in the town square for 20 years on a pike, following it as a warning to the local Native American population to say, don't try this again, because we will do the same thing to you and your loved ones. Um, I also want to talk a little bit about the image on the right-hand side, because I was looking for an image for King Philip's War, and I noticed that 98% of the images, the Native Americans are the aggressor in those images. And typically the Native Americans are um, attacking women and children who are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, sort of the pinnacle of white womanhood and white childhood, and they're typically depicted as scalping them or doing other things like that to them. When in fact, recent scholarship suggests that scalping wasn't a Native American custom or idea, and it was brought over by the European settlers. And moreover, it was the European settlers who were engaging in the practice of scalping more than the Native Americans. So, for example, the Pilgrims and their ancestors or their descendants were actually offering bounties on Wampanoag scalps, and this included the scalps of infants and children. So I just want to make it clear that when you look for images of King Philip's War, um, try to find an image that doesn't show the Native Americans as aggressors and try to interrogate sort of what caused King Philip's War. and what led to it in the first place. Because I know it's easier to just paint the Native Americans as aggressors, but you have to remember that the Wampanoag had basically lived through the apocalypse, and this was their last-ditch attempt to try to stop this apocalypse. The only good thing that came out of King Philip's War was that it put an end to the practice of Indian praying towns, which were started by the Reverend John Eliot. And essentially, they would round up Native Americans. I say Native Americans because it wasn't just Wampanoag. They would round up sort of everyone they could find and put them into 14 praying towns. The indigenous people then could not leave these praying towns, and they were then forcibly converted to Christianity, or as it's better known, cultural genocide was committed in these praying towns. And those who refused to convert to Christianity were put into internment camps on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. The city of Boston actually still refuses to return the bones of these people to the correct tribe that they belonged to, but they were put into internment camps. Many, many died. This caused an even further population loss for the local indigenous people. So, for example, the Wampanoag, around the time of King Philip's War, had been reduced to only 1,000 Wampanoag left alive. And by the time we get to the 18th century, there's only about 240 Wampanoag left alive. And, pre-contact numbers are tens of thousands. So you can see how much the populations were decimated. But I think that these facts and these historical events should put an end to the myth of coexistence. It should just make it very clear that there was no coexistence, because, committing genocide is not coexistence. Massacring Native Americans is not coexistence, and selling them into slavery is not coexistence. And so this myth needs to be stopped in its tracks because it erases what really happened to the Wampanoag. Our third myth is that the Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom, and this is an attempt to make the Pilgrims into heroic figures. But to make it clear, the Pilgrims were not called Pilgrims. The first instance of the Pilgrims being given that moniker is in 1820. They refer to themselves as saints or separatists, which would make you think that they were fleeing religious persecution. But they actually had that moniker before they came to Holland. And in Holland, they received religious freedom. The reason why they decided to come over to the New World was because they did not like Dutch society. They feared what it was doing to their children and what the loose morals were doing to their children. And so they got together and formed the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact was just essentially a group of white men getting together to protect their business interests. So there was no saintly pilgrimage to the New World to try to receive religious freedom. It was mostly a commercial venture. And I want to just make it very clear that the Pilgrims and Puritans are not the same thing, because the reason why this idea that the Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom happened in the first place was because people wrongly assumed that the Pilgrims and Puritans are the same thing. The Pilgrims were the ones who came over in the Mayflower from Holland, and the Puritans were a group that came over after the Pilgrims and settled in Boston and Salem and places like that. And they're the ones we think of as the religious zealots who burned witches. So two totally separate groups that you should not mix up. The fourth myth is that the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. Pilgrims did not land on Plymouth Rock or anywhere near Plymouth at first. For those not familiar with the geography of Massachusetts, I've put a little map here to show where the Pilgrims first arrived, and they first arrived in Provincetown on November 21st, 1620, which is on the outmost cape, and then they traveled to Plymouth, where they landed on December 21st, 1620. But there was certainly no Plymouth Rock at the time, and the reason I say that is because Plymouth Rock was a rock that was in the town square of Plymouth, and the tourism board got together and said, we need more tourists. How can we do this? And so they took that rock, they stamped 1620 on it, they dragged it down to the waterfront, and built a whole national mythology around it. And to me, Plymouth Rock is very much the quantification of these lies. And it shows just how deep these lies go, because they've created an actual physical monument to these lies and to this myth. And they knew it was a lie at the time, and yet they still did it. And yet still thousands upon thousands of tourists come to see Plymouth Rock every year. So this idea of Plymouth Rock, I think, is really dangerous, and it's very much just a quantification of the lies that we have all been told. So to recap the Thanksgiving myth, the Pilgrims were not seeking religious freedom. They did not land on Plymouth Rock. The Wampanoag did welcome them and save them from starvation, but they did not share a harvest feast together because the Pilgrims had already constructed a wall around the Plymouth colony settlement. The Indians did not conveniently fade into the background, but instead were massacred by the settlers. So that is the true history of Thanksgiving. So as you can see, the entire myth is wrong, and it's why you need to throw out your ideas about Thanksgiving in the first place. I also just want to make it clear that when you talk about Thanksgiving and you talk about the Wampanoag people, we still exist. We're still here. You can see that the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe still exists, and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hedequina, which is my tribe, still exists. So don't refer to us in the past tense only. I also want to make it clear that you shouldn't try to reduce the Wampanoag systems of government at the time to primitive systems of government, or the settlers brought over democracy and government and order and law and all these things, because the Wampanoag had a very complex system of government before the Pilgrims arrived, and we continue to have that. So it's just very important that you don't oversimplify sort of the intricacy of Native cultures at the time. And I like to tell people about sort of, people have a tendency to say that like the settlers brought over democracy. And I like to tell people that, the settlers didn't bring over democracy, because our Constitution is actually based upon the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Um, and so, you know, there was no original ideas being brought over besides jails, homophobia, bigotry, things like that. Like horrible things are being brought over. So, like, don't try to excuse what happened to the Wampanoag and what happened to the native peoples of this region by saying that, oh, well, bad things happened to them, but it was in the name of civilization, because we had civilization and we continue to have civilization, and we didn't need settlers to bring it to us. And we also still continue to resist in the spirit of King Philip. So, for example, National Day of Mourning, which my grandfather founded in 1970, continues to be held annually to this day on so-called U.S. Thanksgiving Day. It came about because in 1970, a group of Mayflower descendants decided that they wanted to celebrate the 350th arrival of the Mayflower. And so they asked my grandfather, I'm still not clear why they thought why he would think this was a positive thing, but they asked him to speak at the dinner. And I think they thought it was going to be sort of your typical Native American praises the settlers and thanks them for the civilization they've brought. But my grandfather did not do that, and he wrote a very famous speech that essentially lays bare the Thanksgiving myth and addresses everything I've talked about here. And of course, the people holding the banquet would not allow him to give the speech, and instead actually wanted him to censor the speech. And he refused, and so he and a group of supporters, about 100 supporters, gathered on Coles Hill in Plymouth, where his speech was read and other speeches were read. And this is sort of how National Day of Mourning was born. And like I said, it's been happening annually since 1970. And just as sort of a little extra interesting thing, I will show you the original article about it because I think it's funny. So can you all see that? This is from 1970, and essentially that's my grandfather, and they're just talking about how he chose to skip the 350th banquet because he refused to lie or speak with a forked tongue, as some people said back then. And so, I mean, I guess my point here is just, I don't think people realize how much damage they do when they perpetuate the Thanksgiving myth. Because it seems harmless. It seems, why can't we let our children dress up as pilgrims and Indians and have a harvest feast? And why do you have to ruin national holidays that everyone loves? And, why don't you give thanks? Are you an ungrateful people type thing? But when you celebrate Thanksgiving and when you celebrate the Thanksgiving myth specifically, you're erasing what happened to my ancestors and what happened to, every other tribe after the pilgrims came. You're just essentially whitewashing history, and it's deeply offensive and deeply problematic. And so I would implore everyone here to teach the truth about Thanksgiving and not perpetuate the myth, because we need to start young and we need to start like nipping it in the bud now, because it's very hard, I think, for people to discover they've been lied to. And I see that a lot with college students that I interact with. And, they're angry that they've been lied to their entire lives. So I would just ask you all to please stop perpetuating the Thanksgiving myth, and instead celebrate Wampanoag resistance and teach the true history of Thanksgiving. Thank you.
You're muted.
Okay, I'm up now and I'm trying to get my screen to play. Oops. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Oh, there it is. Okay. Excuse me. That was terrific, Keisha. I don't know when I've had, truly, I don't know when I've had an opportunity to hear someone lay things out as clearly as you did and as powerfully as you did too. So I hope all the teachers that were in this session were paying attention to what you said, because basically what I'm doing is using what you have shared in my presentation, which is a critical look at books written for children. So so much of what you said, I was just like, yes, because I have examples of that throughout my session, throughout my presentation. A few years ago, a gifted teacher from Ohio wrote to me about a fifth grader in one of her classes who had just read your grandfather's speech, and the fifth grader was just stunned and angry because up till then she had not had the truth. And she said, "You mean all those worksheets with smiling Indians on them were wrong?" She was mad because all her teachers up to that point had lied to her. So it's important that we not lie to children, because they will someday know the truth. And then in their eyes, you become suspect as someone who did not do your job, which was to educate. You were miseducating. And you can change that with the kinds of information you got from Keisha. You can be an activist. From the dictionaries, you read that an activist is a person who believes strongly in, I can't see all of my slides. Let me see if I put that away. Yeah, in political or social change. Somebody who takes part in activities and uses social media. That is you, all of you who chose to be here today for this webinar. So on social media and in Native circles during this time of year, Native people express their dread for October and November. And the question is why? And the answer is because of the bias and misrepresentation and disrepresentation that we see all around us. Football season with all its mascots, Columbus Day with those songs that kids are asked to recite, and the coloring sheets that they're asked to do that repeatedly show Indians hiding in the bushes, peeking out at white people as if we were those primitive savages that Keisha has told you we were not that. We also have Halloween with kids dressing up like Indians for that evening. And of course, what today's webinar is about, Thanksgiving. One thing that Keisha is talking about and giving to you is who she is. I am a Kwi of Nambe Owinge every minute of every day. Kwi is our word for woman. I am a woman every single day of a tribal nation called Nambe Owinge that is in the part of the country that is currently called the state of New Mexico. We have had treaty and political and diplomatic negotiations going back hundreds of years. Most recent was with the United States, but ours go back with Spain and Mexico. And there's a record of that. There's a history of that. And I carry that history with me every day. And to see my child or any Pueblo child or any Native child being taught as if we exist only in the past, especially with the way that it's taught at Thanksgiving, is not acceptable. This is my website, American Indians and Children's Literature. I started my career as a teacher and went on to graduate school and started writing articles in books and journals that I, as a former teacher, knew people couldn't afford to buy the books that my articles are in. They couldn't afford to join the professional associations that would bring journal articles to them once a month in various publications. So I started this blog so I could just like push everything out as much as I could and make it free for teachers and librarians and parents and anybody who had the internet. So you can look for my website and you'll find now 15 years, I guess, of work that I've done there. On the bottom is a picture, a screen capture of my Twitter page. So you can follow me on Twitter. I am Deb Reese there. In that picture, I am driving a truck and it's a Ford F-150. And in the back is where my heart is all the time, because that's a picture of some of our sacred spaces, our sacred lands in Nambe Pueblo. That my presence on social media brings a lot of things to me. For example, this is one worksheet that a parent in California sent to me about 2 weeks ago. She said that this was sent home for her child's homework in an alphabetic exercise that she was doing. I have her permission to share it here today, and I intend to roll it over into a blog post. Why the heck are we in 2020 still doing I is for Indian? This is a huge problem. And interestingly, on Twitter, some people said, yeah, it should be I is for Indigenous. I'm like, oh, okay, so they learned a new word, but they didn't get the concept of why this is not okay. Worksheets like this objectify Native people and they invite stereotyping, because here you have two children, one holding a pumpkin and one holding corn. And I bet that if I were to look over W. Abby Mullen's other materials, there is going to be a Thanksgiving page that has those two children on it, because that's what that suggests. Pumpkin and corn suggests Thanksgiving. Oh, yes. So I do that on things. You'll find me doing that on Twitter and on my blog and when I do lectures. One of the most powerful things that goes on in any of our brains is we see an image and the image goes rocket at fast speed into your brain and it stays there. And unless there's some interruption of that message, then it'll stay there like you first saw it. So here I use a lot of red X's to try and interrupt that process, because I don't want those images to live in your brain as if they're okay, because they're not. I've spent, I don't know, 2 minutes talking about that image. All those words that I say don't have as much power as the image of that red X. So I use red X's a lot. And I invite you to do it too in your work. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do today was get an armload of books and look at them. And I want you to do that at your local library. Here is kind of a bullet point of the things that Keisha presented in her session. Stuff about Plymouth Rock. What about that corn? Were the Patuxent decimated by disease? Is that book tribally specific? Does it suggest that peaceful coexistence or a sharing of the land and resources? Does it depict Native peoples as simplistic, uncivilized, or primitive? Does it depict a friendly meal, or are the Native peoples described as peaceful? Does it suggest Native peoples are not part of the present day? So that's kind of a scintillation of what you got from Keisha's presentation. And that's the sort of thing that I would use to evaluate books, this kind of factual information, whatever it is that I'm looking at in terms of a subject or a content area. I have a set of questions that guide me when I'm working through it. So this is that armload of books. I went to my local library about last week and gathered every book that I could find that I could hold in my arms, and that's 19. They said I could take as many as I could carry. So I got 19 books, and this is an array, a photo of those books that I got that day. My sample included 19 books. 2 were from the new books shelf. Every library has a special shelf about brand new books. So 2 of the books I got were from the new books shelf. 13 of them were from the top shelves in the E section of the library, and only from the top half, because if I had to bend down to the lowest shelves, I would, my knees would not let me get back up, but also was carrying a lot of books. So I'm trying to manage the load that I'm carrying and pull books from the shelves as I could. And 4 were from the nonfiction shelf. Now, the way that my local library marks books about Thanksgiving is with a turkey sticker on the binding. And so you see that there in that picture. I brought them home, I read them all, and then I figured out, okay, I've got 3 basic categories of books here. One was a full-on Thanksgiving myths that Keisha described in her presentation. 4 like that. There were 3 that had some kind of a mention in the text or the illustration. And in 12 of the books, big majority of the books, there was nothing in them at all about Native people. I'm going to go through these categories of books now. Interestingly, the 4 that were full-on Thanksgiving books were from the nonfiction section of the library. These are the call numbers from those 4 books. And we're going to look at those because when you pull something from the nonfiction section of your library, you expect it to be factually accurate, right? That's what that section of the library is supposed to be about. So here's one, Thanksgiving by Miriam Nerlove, published in 1990. And as you see, there they are having a nice meal together on the cover of that book. We already know we're not going to use that book, right? But let's look at it a little bit closer. What usually happens when you open a book like that is you have a family, somebody in the family is telling a story about the first Thanksgiving. And that's what happens in this book. And as you go through the story, it's this peaceful thing and Squanto and how they got along together and they ate together, and then it pulls back to the present day again, the family together doing something, eventually eating together. But where's the Native people? Like Keisha said, they just kind of disappear. We didn't disappear. You just wrote us out of history, and that is not acceptable. So here are my 2 red X's to say this book that is in the nonfiction section of my local library should not be there. It was published in 1990, so it's very old, factually inaccurate, and should not be there. Here I want to show you some excerpts from the 3 other nonfiction titles. The first 2 were written from a white perspective. The first one was called Squanto and the First Thanksgiving by Joyce Kessel, published in 1983, very old book. These are 2 lines from it. They, the Patuxet, were friendly and peaceful. His people had all been killed by the white man's plague. That would be Squanto. So you see those things that Keisha is pointing us to. Next one was Thanksgiving by Jane Dudden, published in 1990, again, old, by Macmillan. With the help of the Wampanoag, a friendly Native American tribe, the Pilgrims survived. And they had all died of smallpox. So there we have that friendly again, and that disease killed everybody. The third one is called Squanto's Journey. It is written from a Native perspective, actually from Squanto's perspective. It's called Squanto's Journey, the Story of the First Thanksgiving by Joseph Bruchac, published in 2000 by Harcourt. And here we have a Native person, Squanto, saying, perhaps these men can share our lands as friends. I can't tell you how livid that makes me to have a Native person putting forth that kind of language. And this sentence here, the sickness had come down upon Patuxet like the blow of a war club. Only a few of my people survived. So he is, this Squanto is writing as if he's not Native, or he's an assimilated or colonized Native. So problems with these 4 fiction books that were in the nonfiction section of my library. The mentions were the next 3 books in my sample. The mentions include the Fat Chance Thanksgiving by Patricia Lacken, illustrated by Stacy Schutt and published in 2001. That's the cover on the right. And this is a story about a little girl who has a book about the first Thanksgiving. her apartment house burns down. She's living in a homeless shelter for a little while, and she's thinking about that first Thanksgiving and hoping that her and her mother will be able to be in a safer place soon. And so in more than one place, she's thinking about the first Thanksgiving that has that happy feasting narrative that Keisha's asking us not to use. So let's put some red X's on that. And the next book is The Thanksgiving Door by Debbie Atwell, published in 2003. In there, we have the page on the right where the text for that page says, that looks like a pilgrim and an Indian, but who's that dancing man with the beard? The point is the pilgrim and the Indian, and that you will find many, 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 many children's books that have table settings that have a pilgrim and an Indian. Not okay. So let's give that a red X. I'm kind of going through this because these are the kinds of details that I put on my blog. The only way that anybody is going to do better in the work they do is with the details, with knowing the details of what's wrong and why it's wrong. Just saying, well, Keisha doesn't want us to celebrate Thanksgiving, so I'm not going to use any Thanksgiving books. A parent's going to say, well, but why? And if you can't answer the why, then you're not being an educator. You're being someone that just follows someone's recommendation, but you're not owning the information yourself. So you really have to do that. This third one is called Dino Thanksgiving by Lisa Wheeler, illustrations by Barry Gott. It was published in 2020, so it's from that brand new bookshelf that just came out this year. So I was paging through that. It's this dinosaurs getting together for Thanksgiving, but look, they do that thing that a lot of people do, which is they watch a football game on that day. And here, the Taros watch. It's twin and twin. Both brothers hope the red scales win. I have never seen anything like that. This is obviously a reference to Redskins. This obviously is thought to have been clever. And to a Native person, to me, to other Native people, this is not clever. This is insulting. This is disgusting. This is absolutely not acceptable. So I shared this. I took to social media to share what I saw there. And I tagged the publisher, which is the Learner Publishing Group. And they replied. And I'm sharing this because I want you to do these things. I want you to be that activist who is going to say something on Twitter or on Facebook. Learner replied, we appreciate those who have pointed out this insensitivity. We are changing the team name and reprints, and we're discussing changes to the art as well. And we're doubling down on our commitment to watch for things like this during our production process and do better in the future. Whether or not they will do that remains to be seen. But the point is calling it out, forcing them to respond is important. It creates these ripples. People are looking at this and saying, what happened? What happened? And digging in to find out what happened and why it's not acceptable. The other 12 books that are in my sample are about gatherings, people and animals all coming together for Thanksgiving. This one I want to talk about, and I was so glad that Keisha brought up Abraham Lincoln. This one is Thanksgiving in the White House, and what you're looking at on the cover is Abraham Lincoln's son and the turkey that was being fed by the chef and cooks at the White House because they were going to kill it for Thanksgiving, and Todd had been feeding it and didn't want it to be killed, and so he told his daddy, we can't do that. And so Lincoln said, right, we can't do that. And so it's that story. But in the back matter, we also learned that Abraham Lincoln issued that first proclamation of Thanksgiving on October 3rd of 1863. We also have a page of notes that says that in the Civil War, about 620,000 men and boys were killed and over 50,000 were amputees. That's really important information about the Civil War. And we also learned that Lincoln freed the slaves and reunified the country. The problem with any book about Abraham Lincoln is that information that is left out. The United States-Dakota War of 1862 happened the year before he issued that proclamation. 303 Dakota men were sentenced to death. And Lincoln thought, well, we can't really hang 303 men, so I'll review the files. So he reviewed the files, the court cases of these 303 Dakota men who had been sentenced to death. With this in mind, he thought, okay, we can't execute 303. I know, and I'm just paraphrasing his words because I don't have a record of that. We do have the factual, this is factual. What he decided was he would only order the execution of the ones that had raped women. But there were only 2 that had raped a woman. So that wasn't enough. This just blows my mind. It's quite astonishing to me. Two women, hanging two was not enough. That wouldn't satisfy the bloodlust of all those white people who wanted all those Dakota people to be executed. So he went back over the files again and ended up selecting 38 Dakota men who were in fact hung on December 26th of 1862. And if you just look up mass execution in the United States, you will find etchings that were made of that time period, because there's a gallows with all these men being hung in a square, and people gathered around to watch. That kind of information about Lincoln and decisions that he made needs to be part of the national narrative, the stories that children are told about Native people. Keisha talked about the National Day of Mourning and how that happened in 1970. And I think that if we look up that history and talk and listen and think about what she's presented about it, we should have books about this, about the National Day of Mourning itself, and a more accurate telling of history. But right now, as far as I know, there are no children's books about the National Day of Mourning. People will say, oh, but it's not appropriate to have a picture book about violence committed against a people. My goodness, think about the children. That's not age appropriate. I hope you can tell I'm speaking quite cynically and smarty, because that is the kind of rebuttal that we hear over and over when we try to bring forth the actual history of the United States. But if we just pause and think about other moments in history, September 11th, there are tons of children's books about September 11th. We don't hesitate to tell children about that. We've got plenty of books for them about that. We need those books for other moments in history as well. Those 12 books about feasting and turkeys, they erase facts. They provide comfort for the erasure of those facts. And I wonder, do they qualify as propaganda? I want everybody here to be an activist. Take what you're learning from Keisha, interrupt the wrongs that are being taught to children. We can all do better, and we must. That's it for my presentation. Are you guys there? Oh, okay.
That was awesome. Thank you, Debbie. Leslie, how much time do we have? Oh, I can't hear you. You're on mute. Leslie,
So
could you
we
please?
we have about 5 minutes. So if you want to just introduce yourself, and then we'll go over 2 or 3 of these and then leave a couple of minutes for any questions.
Sounds good. Okay. Bonjour. Jonah Andeg indish nakaz megizidu dame ninda au odawazaga iganing and dunjaba. My name is Joan Andeg. I am an enrolled member of the Lakudere Band of Lake Superior, Anishinaabe. Our word for woman is Kwe. So I'm Ninda Anishinaabe Kwe. I'm an Anishinaabe woman. Anishinaabe is our word for people. So I'm saying I am a human being. Leslie asked me to discuss a few writing prompts and some of the problems with them. So just very quickly, if I could run through these. So this was a prompt about the little girl on the left, Mari Kopeni, and Autumn Peltier on the right, two children who are often, their stories are presented and they're described as water warriors, like protecting water, protecting people. So without the details, it's hard to see, but basically the writing prompt was telling the story of each of these young women, and the actions some of the actions they've taken, and the ways in which they're trying to protect the environment, protect water, and protect people from contaminated water. I want to skip this one and come back to it really quick. So this prompt is problematic in that it talks about children, it talks about Native people as past tense. So you will often see Native people talked about from the time period of European encounter, and often we are depicted as sort of like a story told by a white European settler based on anthropological data and artifacts. So you might see this is like this prompt was about how that the children were being asked, or I'm sorry, that the children had to do work to contribute to the community, and they didn't have as much time to play as children do today. And so it was sort of imposing all of these white Euro settler assumptions and paradigm on an anthropological assessment. So the white gaze viewing another culture from the outside, based in the past, and telling a story about that culture, and then children today being asked to write from this prompt are being taught that Native people lived in the past. They're being taught the colonizer name for the tribe Iroquois, not the Native people's own name for themselves, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and being taught that sort of that you can make up a story about other people and tell that story as factual without ever acknowledging the agency of the people the story is about. So if we could skip to the next one.
Yep. Oh yeah.
This one is just horrifically I don't even know the words for it. It's hard for me even to read it. It's a reference to the boarding school era, in which Native children were removed by the thousands, were removed from their families and sent to often thousands of miles away to boarding schools, where they were systematically stripped of their culture and identity as Native people, to their cultural heritage. They were stripped of their languages. There are stories of children being beaten for speaking their language. They were forced to assimilate to white culture and taught sort of servant trades. And the motto of the person who founded Carlisle was "Kill the Indian and save the man." So these were horrific experiences, and it's traumatic even to read that this is being used as a writing prompt, or that this is being taught in this way, because the stories of the survivors of the boarding schools belong to those people and those tribes, and for somebody else to come in and tell their story as if they have any right to it. And I mean, and look at what this says. Imagine that you are a member of the Lakota Nation. So this is problematic because okay, so I've seen a trend that educators are asking children, I have a fourth grader, they're asking children to imagine themselves into a particular historical period or event and take the role of one of the characters, one of the historical figures, and then imagine from that place what the experience was. And this is taught as education. And so what they're essentially doing is teaching the kids that what they think about somebody else's experience is essentially fact. That without ever, so and then this writing prompt, have fun with how you sneak the letter, have fun with it. This was, I mean, children were brutalized and sexually assaulted, abused, emotionally and spiritually. It was horrific, and this should not be taught by anyone other than people from the affected groups, and never in this way. Can we skip to the next one?
Yes, can I just add that this was a prompt that my son had in school, and I called the school and complained. And his blessed teacher wrote back and said, I will stop this assignment right now. Can you come in this afternoon? I want to hear from you, and we are not going to do this again. So as Dr. Reese shared earlier, that when we speak up, we can have an impact. And I just want to follow that with, I was so devastated by this because of how it trivializes, because of how it dehumanizes. And for me, it just opened this whole wound of, this is how it happened to me. This is how I became dehumanized.
Leslie, I'd like to continue. May I
Yes, yes,
continue
yes.
on the next slide? Thank you.
And not just dehumanized, but lost my.
Okay, this one is, this one also asks children to assess and evaluate somebody else's experience. So the movement to end native mascots is coming from the perspective of historically oppressed, genocided, marginalized people who are responding to the oppressors, the genociders, the colonizers, taking their images and aspects of their culture and commodifying it and using it as a symbol for their own purposes. And then in school, so with this writing prompt, we're teaching kids that it's within their personal authority to evaluate the claims of the Native people and decide whether the reasoning is sound. This is so offensive. Can we skip to the next one? Okay, describe an example of how Native American intelligence is portrayed in such and such videos. Would we ever describe an example of how white people intelligence is portrayed in this? This implies lack of intelligence. You know, if we have to prove or describe intelligence, this to me just brings up those tropes of primitivism and uncivilized savages that the European settler colonial culture has been using since the beginning to justify the theft of the land and to justify the genocide of the more than 1,000 different nations of people who lived on this land for thousands of years, since the beginning of time. And in the last 500 years, we've all faced apocalypse. All of the indigenous people worldwide have been facing apocalypse, as Keisha brought up. So can we skip back to the first one then? So I just want to show you, like at first glance, this might look okay. So we've got two young women of color. We're telling a sort of a story of their accomplishments and sort of a heroic actions that they've been taking. But it's still the white settler perspective, kind of claiming these children, claiming, like, okay, so what I see here is I see tokenism. So I see these people being used as tokens of their culture, marginalization, because it's exploitation and extraction. Okay, so you don't see the writing prompt, but in the prompt, it's a story about them. So it is not the girls telling their own stories. It is somebody else has claimed their images from the internet, has extracted information, extracted facts from their lives, and written a story about it. I think some of this was in the Scholastic newsletter. So it's been packaged and commodified, and it's still the it's still white supremacy, because it's still the the European colonizer culture saying, our culture is preeminent. Like this is the world as it is. And all of the attempts of diversity, equity, and inclusion are to diversify the white reality, to be equitable, to share the spoils of our conquest a little bit more with historically marginalized and oppressed people. Inclusion, to include these historically marginalized people in our dominant culture. But the only way really to move past this is to step back and listen to the voices of the people themselves, rather than tell stories about them. And certainly not to teach our children that it's okay to tell stories about other people. So I'll mute now so we can have a few minutes of questions.
And just to wrap up, if you're able, there are two wonderful organizations, the National Day of Mourning and the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. I will be following up with an email thanking you for your attendance, and I'll share out these two links. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have any other materials that you suggest, or websites or books?
I would recommend looking at Own Voices. And if you go to Dr. Debbie Reese's website, you'll find lists and lists of books that are Own Voices. But Joan, Keisha, Dr. Debbie Reese, do you have anything you would add?
Okay, thank you.
I would just say in general to look for materials written by or videos or whatever resources that are written by people or prepared by people of that tribe or that nation.
Feel free to put any questions into chat if you have any.
While we're waiting, I can say that Own Voices is a hashtag that started online about 5 years ago by a woman named, her last name is DeVoice. And it was the idea that a book or picture book written by someone who identifies themselves as part of the group that the character is of meant that you would have a more authentic depiction of that particular person or group. And it works to a certain degree, but its failings have become clear over time. And now I am trying to say Wampanoag voice rather than Own Voice, because I want a book about the Wampanoag National Day of Mourning written by someone who's Wampanoag and not by someone who's Pueblo, because there are things that I may not understand that Keisha would understand. And so looking for tribally specific books written by people of that particular nation is what I recommend.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in through chat. I would like to thank you all. And if you could all unmute for a moment, just to thank our presenters. I'm inviting everybody to unmute. If you want to go ahead
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fabulous.
So great.
Wonderful. Couldn't have been better.
Thank you so much. It, boy, gives you a lot of food for thought, and it is appreciated.